In the fading months of 1941, the sprawling British Empire stood at a precarious crossroads, clutching tightly to its prized jewel in the east. The island of Singapore, widely proclaimed as the Impregnable Fortress, was the linchpin of Allied defense across the Pacific theater. To this sweltering, jungle-clad outpost came the Australian 8th Division, a force brimming with youthful optimism and an unshakable belief in the invincibility of British military might. Yet, beneath the polished brass and crisp uniforms, a quiet unease began to stir among the more observant officers surveying the land. The geopolitical atmosphere was suffocatingly tense, though the high command in Malaya projected an aura of absolute, unyielding confidence to the world. They relied heavily on the legendary coastal artillery, massive 15-inch guns pointing out toward the Southern Ocean, waiting for an enemy fleet that would never arrive from that direction. General Gordon Bennett, the fiery and controversial Australian commander, often voiced his frustrations in private meetings, muttering darkly, "We are locking the front door while leaving the back gate swinging wide open to the jungle." His prescient warnings, however, were largely ignored by his superiors. British strategists harbored a fatal misconception about the dense Malayan jungle stretching hundreds of miles to the north of the island fortress. They considered this impenetrable green wall a natural barrier, assuming no modern mechanized army could possibly traverse its treacherous swamps and thick undergrowth. Because of this dangerous illusion, the northern landward defenses were scandalously underdeveloped, leaving the Allied troops dangerously exposed. Was this arrogant dismissal of the terrain a simple miscalculation, or the fatal hubris of an empire that had grown too comfortable in its centuries of unchallenged global supremacy? Compounding this strategic blindness was the shocking state of Allied air power stationed across the Malayan Peninsula in late 1941. Instead of modern fighter planes capable of intercepting a sophisticated enemy, the airfields were littered with obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, sluggish machines that pilots grimly joked were flying coffins. Australian soldiers looking up at the tropical sky felt a growing sense of vulnerability as they realized their aerial shield was virtually non-existent. Without dominance in the air, the ground forces would soon find themselves subjected to relentless, unopposed bombardment from an unseen and technologically superior enemy. The naval situation offered no greater comfort to the thousands of Australian infantrymen digging trenches in the suffocating tropical heat of Johor. The British Royal Navy, stretched incredibly thin by the desperate struggle in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, could only spare a token deterrent force. The arrival of the magnificent battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser Repulse was met with roaring cheers, providing a fleeting moment of soaring morale. Yet, naval experts whispered anxiously among themselves, "Where are the aircraft carriers to protect them when the sky darkens with enemy bombers?" Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Tokyo, General Tomoyuki Yamashita was meticulously finalizing a brilliantly audacious plan that would shatter the British illusion. The Tiger of Malaya, as he would soon be known, recognized that the formidable coastal guns of Singapore were entirely useless if attacked from the rear. He gathered a highly trained force of battle-hardened veterans, men who had honed their ruthless combat skills in the grueling campaigns across mainland China. They did not see the Malayan jungle as an impenetrable wall, but rather as a shadowy highway leading straight to ultimate victory. Time was rapidly running out for the complacent defenders as the fateful month of December approached with a deceptive tropical calmness. The Australian troops, still acclimatizing to the oppressive humidity, spent their days conducting repetitive drills and building defensive perimeters that felt increasingly inadequate. Intelligence reports indicating massive Japanese troop movements in the South China Sea were frequently dismissed as mere posturing or intimidation tactics. How could an empire so vast and powerful fail to recognize the gathering storm that was about to unleash unprecedented destruction upon its most vital and cherished eastern stronghold? The devastating illusion of security was violently shattered in the early hours of December 8, 1941, just before dawn broke. While the world's attention was suddenly fixed on the catastrophic attack at Pearl Harbor, Japanese transport ships materialized out of the dark. They unleashed a ferocious amphibious assault on the northern beaches of Malaya at Kota Baru, catching the thinly stretched defenders completely off guard. The unimaginable had suddenly become a terrifying reality. The enemy was not attacking from the sea in the south, but pouring through the dense northern jungle gates. Chaos immediately gripped the Allied command centers as frantic reports of heavily armed Japanese troops storming the beaches flooded the communication lines. General Arthur Percival, the British commander of Malaya Command, faced the daunting reality that his entire defensive doctrine was collapsing within hours. The Japanese infantry advanced with terrifying speed and ruthless efficiency, utilizing bicycles to silently navigate the narrow rubber plantation tracks in darkness. Australian soldiers, stationed further south, listened to the distant thunder of artillery, gripping their rifles and wondering when the surging tide of the enemy would finally reach their defensive positions. In a desperate gamble to halt the rapid enemy advance, the Pride of the British fleet was ordered to intercept the Japanese landing forces. Admiral Tom Phillips led Force Z, consisting of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, northward without any land-based fighter cover to protect them. The sailors aboard these mighty vessels stood at their battle stations, scanning the horizon with a mixture of steely determination and creeping dread. If they find us out here without air support, we are nothing but sitting ducks, a young gunnery officer muttered to his nervous companion. The worst fears of the Naval Command were violently realized on the morning of December 10th off the eastern coast of Malaya. Swarms of Japanese torpedo bombers descended from the clouds, executing a flawlessly coordinated attack against the two colossal British warships struggling below. Without defensive fighters, the ships could only rely on their anti-aircraft guns, throwing a desperate curtain of lead into the chaotic sky. The ocean erupted in towering geysers of white water as torpedoes slammed into thick armored hulls, tearing massive, fatal gashes into the pride of the invincible Royal Navy. The sinking of the Prince of Wales and the Repulse sent a shockwave of absolute despair rippling through the entire Allied command structure. In mere hours, the protective naval shield of Singapore had been obliterated, leaving the island completely exposed to maritime blockade and bombardment. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later confessed that this catastrophic news was the heaviest blow he received during the entire global conflict. For the Australian troops waiting anxiously in Malaya, the message was terrifyingly clear. They were now entirely cut off, abandoned, and fighting a desperate war for pure survival. With control of the sea and the sky firmly in Japanese hands, the momentum of the invasion accelerated to a breakneck, terrifying pace. Yamashita's forces bypassed heavy defensive strongpoints by executing daring amphibious flanking maneuvers through the coastal swamps, continually outmaneuvering the bewildered Allied forces. The British and Indian units stationed in the north were forced into a chaotic, disorganized retreat down the peninsula toward the supposed safety of Singapore. The supposedly impenetrable jungle had betrayed them, serving as a protective cloak for an enemy that struck with the speed and ferocity of a venomous snake. As the battered northern regiments fell back, the responsibility of halting the relentless Japanese juggernaut shifted heavily onto the Australian 8th Division. General Bennett hurriedly deployed his men along key roads and rivers in the southern state of Johor, determined to stage a bloody stand. The Australian soldiers, known for their fierce independence and aggressive fighting spirit, dug their trenches deep into the muddy, mosquito-infested Malayan soil. They knew the enemy was approaching rapidly, a seemingly unstoppable force that had already humiliated the greatest military empire on earth in a matter of a few chaotic days. The air hung heavy with the stench of burning rubber plantations and the distant, constant rumble of approaching enemy artillery fire. Refugees clogged the narrow dirt roads, a tragic procession of terrified civilians fleeing southward away from the advancing violence and destruction. Australian machine gunners checked their ammunition belts repeatedly, staring into the dark tree line where the Japanese vanguard was expected to suddenly materialize. "Let the bastards come," a sergeant whispered grimly to his platoon. "We will show them that taking this island won't be a walk in the park like they bloody well think." Despite the bravado of the troops on the ground, a profound sense of strategic doom began to settle over the Allied headquarters. The realization that the massive coastal guns were pointing the wrong way became a bitter, agonizing joke among the exhausted frontline soldiers. Every defensive calculation, every logistical assumption made by the British war planners over the past decade was systematically dismantled by Yamashita's brilliant aggression. The Impregnable Fortress was not merely under attack. Its very foundation of arrogant colonial superiority was crumbling rapidly into dust before the eyes of the terrified world. The Australian forces realized they were not fighting to secure a glorious victory, but rather attempting to delay an inevitable, crushing disaster. They lacked sufficient anti-tank weaponry to stop the nimble Japanese armor that tore relentlessly through the fragile barricades constructed along the roadsides. The relentless tropical heat and torrential rain sapped the strength of the defenders, while the Japanese troops seemed to draw relentless energy from their constant victories. The stage was now set for a series of brutal, desperate holding actions that would paint the dense Malayan peninsula red with the blood of young men. In the suffocating command bunkers beneath Singapore, General Percival stared blankly at the map, tracking the rapid, unstoppable collapse of his northern front. The carefully drawn red lines indicating Allied defenses were continually erased and pushed southward toward the narrow Johor Strait, separating Malaya from the island. He frantically requested massive reinforcements from London, begging for modern fighter squadrons and fresh infantry divisions to stem the bleeding. However, he secretly knew that any help would arrive far too late to prevent the impending catastrophe that was already unfolding right on his immediate doorstep. The psychological warfare employed by the advancing Japanese forces was as devastating as their relentless physical assaults on the battered Allied positions. Leaflets rained down from the sky, urging the Australian and Indian troops to surrender and abandon the crumbling, decadent British imperial cause. Fifth columnists and spies within the civilian population added to the paranoia, making the defenders feel entirely surrounded by hostile, unseen forces. As the shadow of the rising sun stretched longer across the peninsula, the desperate defenders prepared for the horrific crucible of jungle combat that awaited them in the coming days. The illusion of the impregnable fortress had been completely shattered, leaving behind a terrifying reality of isolation, tactical inferiority, and impending death. The Australian 8th Division now stood as the last significant barrier between Yamashita's veteran army and the vulnerable heart of the island itself. The soldiers loaded their rifles, listening intently to the sounds of the jungle, waiting for the inevitable clash of steel and fire. The bloody retreat down the Malayan peninsula was about to begin, and the ultimate fate of an empire hung precariously in the fragile balance of their courage. Every shadow in the jungle seemed to conceal a lethal threat, transforming the once tranquil tropical landscape into an inescapable green nightmare. The commanders knew that executing a coordinated withdrawal under heavy enemy pressure was one of the most difficult maneuvers in military doctrine. The men had to fight fiercely by day to hold the line, only to march exhaustingly through the perilous darkness to establish new positions. This grueling cycle of combat and retreat eroded their physical endurance and severely tested the mental fortitude of even the most battle-hardened Australian veterans on the ground. As the first week of the brutal campaign drew to a close, the stark reality of their desperate situation became undeniably apparent. The troops on the front lines understood that no miraculous rescue fleet was sailing across the horizon to deliver them from this hellish nightmare. They were completely reliant on their own discipline, the limited ammunition in their pouches, and the unwavering loyalty of the man standing beside them. The stage was tragically set for one of the most catastrophic defeats in modern military history, a bloody saga of courage overshadowed by catastrophic leadership failures. The myth of the impassable Malayan jungle dissolved into a brutal reality as the Japanese Imperial Army advanced with terrifying speed. General Yamashita utilized a highly unconventional but devastatingly effective method of transport by deploying thousands of bicycles. Instead of becoming bogged down in the thick mud, Japanese infantry silently pedaled down the narrow pathways of rubber plantations, moving remarkably faster than the retreating British and Indian columns. Would the exhausted Allied forces ever manage to establish a solid defensive line against an enemy that seemed to materialize from the very shadows of the dense tropical foliage? Compounding this rapid infantry movement was the shocking introduction of Japanese light tanks, machines the British High Command had arrogantly deemed impossible to operate in jungle terrain. These metal beasts crashed through the undergrowth, spreading panic among troops who had not been equipped with adequate anti-tank weaponry. The clatter of tank treads echoed through the dense canopy, a mechanical death knell signaling the relentless pursuit of Yamashita's vanguard. As the Allied soldiers desperately scrambled backward, a horrifying question began to haunt their every waking moment regarding how long flesh and bone could withstand the crushing armor. By mid-January of 1942, the desperate burden of halting this seemingly invincible tide fell squarely upon the shoulders of the Australian 8th Division. Major General Gordon Bennett meticulously planned a massive ambush at a bridge near the town of Gemus, hoping to strike a crippling blow against the overconfident Japanese forces. The Australian troops concealed themselves perfectly within the dense roadside vegetation, their fingers resting lightly on the triggers of their weapons, waiting in suffocating silence. The air crackled with unbearable tension as the rhythmic sound of hundreds of approaching enemy bicycles finally reached their concealed defensive positions. As the Japanese column carelessly crossed the wooden bridge, the explosive charges were detonated, sending splintered timber and shattered bodies flying into the murky river below. The Australians unleashed a devastating torrent of machine gun fire and artillery shells, transforming the narrow road into a horrific slaughterhouse of twisted metal and screams. "Give them hell, boys. Make them pay for every single inch," a hardened Australian sergeant roared above the deafening chaos, directing the relentless barrage. For a brief, glorious moment, the illusion of Japanese invincibility was violently shattered by the sheer ferocity of the executed ambush. However, the euphoria of the tactical victory at Gemas was tragically short-lived, as the true genius of Yamashita's relentless operational strategy immediately revealed itself. Instead of launching futile frontal assaults against the entrenched Australian positions, the Japanese simply melted into the surrounding jungle and executed wide flanking maneuvers. They utilized small boats to navigate the complex network of coastal rivers, silently bypassing the heavy Allied defenses and cutting off their vital supply lines from the rear. The terrifying realization suddenly dawned on the frontline commanders that their brilliant ambush had merely delayed the inevitable encirclement by hours. The strategic situation rapidly deteriorated as a massive Japanese amphibious force unexpectedly landed near the vital coastal town of Muar, threatening to completely sever the Allied retreat. An understrength Indian brigade stationed there was quickly overwhelmed by the ferocity of the veteran Japanese Imperial Guards, creating a catastrophic gap in the defensive line. General Bennett frantically ordered his elite Australian battalions to plug this bleeding hole, throwing them into a desperate, chaotic meat grinder of brutal close combat. The battle for Muar would quickly devolve into one of the most savage and desperate engagements of the entire disastrous military campaign. In the suffocating heat of the Muar sector, the Australian soldiers found themselves fighting a nightmarish, multi-directional battle against an enemy that attacked relentlessly from the swamps. Ammunition quickly dwindled, and medical supplies vanished as the casualty numbers soared exponentially under the constant barrage of enemy mortar fire and aerial bombardment. "Hold the line at all costs, or the entire retreating army is doomed," a wounded officer instructed his exhausted men, his voice barely audible over the exploding shells. Would these isolated pockets of courageous resistance be completely annihilated before any extraction orders could reach their compromised radios? As the Japanese noose violently tightened around the Australian and Indian defenders at Muar, a desperate fighting withdrawal was ordered toward the critical bridge at Parit Sulong. The retreating columns, burdened with hundreds of critically wounded men piled onto bullet-riddled trucks, fought their way through a gauntlet of devastating sniper fire and heavy roadblocks. When the battered vanguard finally reached the bridge, they discovered to their absolute horror that it had already been heavily fortified by the rapidly advancing Japanese infantry. The retreating forces were now completely trapped in a deadly choke point, surrounded by an unforgiving enemy demanding immediate surrender. The heavily outnumbered Australians launched several suicidal bayonet charges against the Japanese barricades at the bridge, desperately trying to smash a pathway to safety for their wounded comrades. Despite their astonishing valor, the intense enemy machine gun fire mercilessly mowed down the attackers, turning the muddy road into a horrific river of blood and broken bodies. Realizing that the encirclement could not be broken, the commanding officers made the agonizing decision to order all able-bodied men to disperse into the treacherous jungle. They were forced to leave the severely wounded behind, a tragic necessity that would result in a brutal massacre. Small, fragmented groups of Australian survivors plunged deep into the hostile, unforgiving Malayan jungle, desperately attempting to navigate their way southward through the crocodile-infested swamps. They endured unimaginable physical torment, suffering from severe tropical ulcers, rampant malaria, and agonizing starvation as they painstakingly hacked their way through the impenetrable green darkness. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent surges of pure adrenaline through their emaciated bodies, fearing a sudden ambush by relentless Japanese patrols hunting them down. Could these broken, exhausted men somehow traverse miles of lethal wilderness and reach the island sanctuary before the final bridge was ultimately destroyed? Back in the subterranean command bunkers of Singapore, General Arthur Percival watched the agonizing destruction of his mainland army with a profound sense of utter helplessness. The maps adorning the damp concrete walls illustrated a horrifying reality where defensive lines were continuously collapsing, compressing his battered forces into an increasingly shrinking defensive perimeter. High command in London continuously sent frantic cables demanding that the peninsula be held at all costs, completely disconnected from the catastrophic tactical reality on the bloody ground. Percival secretly knew that a full withdrawal to the island was the only logical option left to prevent total annihilation. As January drew to a bloody close, the fateful, heartbreaking order was finally broadcasted to all remaining Allied units to abandon the Malayan mainland entirely and retreat. This directive sparked a massive, chaotic exodus down the primary southern highway as thousands of exhausted soldiers, battered vehicles, and terrified civilian refugees desperately bottlenecked. Japanese aircraft ruthlessly strafed the congested roads, transforming the desperate retreat into a horrific spectacle of burning wreckage and widespread, uncontrollable panic among the massive crowds. The soldiers marched with heavy hearts, understanding that they were trading the vast jungle for a tiny, overcrowded island trap with absolutely no escape route. The ultimate lifeline for the retreating army was the massive stone Johor Causeway, connecting the southern tip of Malaya to Singapore. Military engineers feverishly packed thousands of pounds of high explosives into the heavy concrete pillars, preparing to sever the physical link to the mainland. Australian troops acting as the rear guard fought desperately to hold the perimeter, scanning the burning northern horizon for final stragglers trying to outrun the enemy. The terrifying question hung heavily in the smoky air. Would they detonate the bridge early, trapping their own men? Throughout the grueling night of January 30th, the continuous, somber procession of defeated soldiers trudged wearily across the causeway under the pale, haunting glow of the moonlight. The men were practically walking skeletons, their uniforms completely shredded, their eyes hollow with the profound trauma of relentless combat and the bitter sting of continuous defeat. Scottish pipers stood at the island end of the massive bridge, playing hauntingly mournful melodies that drifted across the dark water, welcoming the shattered remnants of the army. "Keep moving, lads. Do not look back," a military policeman urged gently, guiding traumatized veterans into the fortress. As dawn prepared to break on the final day of January, the heroic remnants of the Australian rearguard finally broke contact with the aggressively advancing Japanese vanguard. They sprinted toward the causeway in the twilight, a desperate, breathless dash for survival, while enemy artillery shells began to wildly impact the water surrounding the massive stone structure. The sappers watched nervously, their hands trembling slightly on the explosive plungers, waiting for the absolute last Allied soldier to cross the designated safety line on the concrete. The tension was absolutely suffocating, every passing second increasing the risk of Japanese tanks seizing the crucial bridge entirely intact. At exactly 8:15 in the morning on January 31st, a tremendous, earth-shattering explosion violently ripped through the air, completely obliterating the serene silence of the tropical morning. A colossal geyser of seawater, pulverized concrete, and twisted steel erupted spectacularly into the sky, severing the vital physical connection between the Malayan Peninsula and the island fortress. The deafening roar of the detonation echoed for miles, serving as a bleak, undeniable punctuation mark to a disastrous, profoundly humiliating military campaign across the massive mainland. The retreating Allied soldiers stood on the northern shores of Singapore, staring silently at the massive, violently smoking crater. The destruction of the causeway successfully halted the immediate Japanese land advance, but it also fundamentally sealed the tragic, inescapable fate of the massive Allied military garrison. They were now completely trapped on a small, heavily congested island measuring barely 200 square miles, completely surrounded by hostile waters and aggressively patrolled enemy skies. The Impregnable Fortress had been violently transformed into a sprawling, inescapable prison camp for over 80,000 desperate soldiers and hundreds of thousands of terrified civilian inhabitants. General Yamashita simply halted his victorious troops on the northern shore of the strait, gazing intently across the narrow strip of dark water. From the elevated vantage point of the Sultan of Johor's palace, the Tiger of Malaya surveyed the besieged island of Singapore with cold, calculated, and profound strategic satisfaction. He had driven an overwhelming imperial force down the entire length of the peninsula in merely 54 days, a logistical and tactical masterpiece that shocked the entire civilized world. However, Yamashita secretly knew his own supply lines were dangerously overextended, and his artillery ammunition was dropping to alarmingly low levels after the relentless, rapid military advance. He had to cross the water and crush the remaining defenders swiftly, utilizing psychological terror to break their wavering resolve completely. Across the dark, treacherous waters of the Johor Strait, the battered Australian 8th Division was assigned the daunting task of defending the volatile northwestern sector of the besieged island. The men collapsed into the muddy, poorly constructed trenches, their bodies completely ravaged by dysentery, relentless exhaustion, and the horrifying memories of the bloody massacre at Parit Sulong. They stared blankly into the dense mangrove swamps lining the opposing shoreline, acutely aware that the enemy was relentlessly gathering their aggressive strength just out of sight. How could an army so thoroughly broken in spirit possibly repel the inevitable, massive amphibious assault that was rapidly approaching their vulnerable shores? General Percival confidently assured the civilian population that the island could hold out for months, but the frontline commanders recognized this optimistic rhetoric as dangerous, delusional fiction. The Japanese heavy artillery had already been stealthily maneuvered into firing positions along the mainland coast, completely pre-registered on key military installations, hospitals, and critical infrastructure across Singapore. The defenders lacked the necessary aerial reconnaissance to locate and destroy these lethal batteries, leaving them entirely at the mercy of the impending, catastrophic bombardment. The suffocating tropical air grew incredibly thick with tension, as everyone nervously anticipated the terrifying roar of incoming enemy shells. The disastrous Malayan retreat had permanently shattered the deeply ingrained colonial myth of Western racial and military superiority in the eyes of the terrified Asian civilian populace. The invincible British Empire had been decisively outmaneuvered, outfought, and humiliated by an incredibly adaptive Asian army riding stolen bicycles through the supposedly impenetrable, protective green jungle canopy. The surviving Australian soldiers, once brimming with arrogant confidence, now understood the terrifying lethality and absolute ruthlessness of the veteran Japanese imperial forces massing violently against them. They polished their bayonets in the oppressive heat, fully accepting that their ultimate, bloody reckoning was now only a matter of days away. As the sun violently dipped below the horizon on that fateful January evening, an eerie, unsettling silence descended upon the heavily contested waters of the narrow Johor Strait. The massive coastal guns of Singapore remained tragically silent, their giant barrels pointing uselessly out toward the empty southern ocean, while the true enemy waited quietly in the dark north. The bloody retreat had officially ended, but the most horrific, desperate chapter of the unfolding tragedy was just about to begin in the impending, suffocating darkness. The fortress was finally under direct siege, and the true nightmare of urban destruction was merely taking its preliminary, fateful breaths before unleashing hell. As February commenced, a sinister calmness settled over the narrow Johor Strait, masking the devastating storm that General Yamashita was meticulously preparing. The Japanese commander covertly moved his elite divisions into the dense jungle directly opposite the northwestern shores of Singapore Island. Across this treacherous stretch of dark water, the exhausted men of the Australian 22nd Brigade stared into the oppressive mangrove swamps. They were stretched unbelievably thin across an impossibly wide defensive sector, isolated and shivering in the damp, unforgiving tropical night. Could this fragile, fragmented human shield possibly withstand the impending, catastrophic blow? Lieutenant General Arthur Percival made a profoundly fatal strategic miscalculation regarding the precise location of the inevitable Japanese amphibious assault. Believing Yamashita would strike the northeastern beaches, he stubbornly concentrated his strongest and freshest British forces there, leaving the vulnerable northwest disastrously underdefended. Major General Gordon Bennett desperately pleaded for reinforcements, arguing that the dense mangroves offered the perfect concealment for enemy landing craft. His urgent warnings were tragically dismissed by high command, sealing the bloody fate of the isolated Australian battalions waiting in the suffocating darkness. The geography of the northwestern coast was a tactical nightmare for the deeply entrenched but heavily outnumbered Australian defenders. Tangled mangrove roots created an impenetrable maze that obstructed any clear lines of sight and severely limited the effective placement of defensive machine guns. Furthermore, the massive coastal artillery batteries situated on the southern tip of the island possessed armor-piercing shells designed entirely for attacking heavy naval warships. These colossal projectiles were practically useless against scattered enemy infantry landing on soft, muddy beaches. a horrifying realization that left the soldiers completely exposed to slaughter. Yamashita unleashed his psychological terror campaign with terrifying precision, utilizing intense aerial bombardment and relentless artillery barrages to break the defenders' spirits. For an entire week, Japanese heavy guns rained continuous destruction upon the island's vital infrastructure, systematically destroying communication lines, medical facilities, and crucial water reservoirs. The Australian troops cowered in their muddy, shallow trenches, their eardrums violently assaulted by the deafening, ceaseless concussions of exploding high-explosive ordnance. "They are softening us up for the slaughter, just waiting for the right moment to cross," a terrified young private whispered to his trembling companion. The deafening climax of this horrific artillery duel violently erupted on the terrifying, fateful morning of February 8, 1942. Japanese gunners initiated the most concentrated, devastating artillery bombardment in the entire Malayan campaign, systematically obliterating the fragile Australian frontline positions along the northwestern coast. Entire defensive bunkers were vaporized in blinding flashes of explosive fury, burying hundreds of desperate soldiers alive beneath tons of pulverized concrete and shattered timber. How could any human being possibly survive this apocalyptic tempest of fire and steel tearing relentlessly through the trembling earth? Under the protective cover of this unprecedented, earth-shattering barrage, Yamashita finally launched the decisive amphibious assault that would shatter the British Empire. Thousands of battle-hardened Japanese infantrymen silently boarded small, collapsible wooden boats and motorized landing craft hidden within the murky mainland estuaries. They navigated across the dark, treacherous waters of the Johor Strait with chilling precision, their eyes fixed intently upon the burning shoreline of the supposedly impregnable island fortress. The ultimate, bloody reckoning had finally arrived, entirely bypassing the useless, colossal naval guns pointing futilely toward the empty southern horizon. The first waves of Japanese landing craft violently struck the muddy shores of the Australian defensive sector just before midnight. The exhausted, shell-shocked defenders immediately opened a desperate, withering fire from their surviving machine gun nests, turning the dark water crimson with enemy blood. Despite suffering horrific casualties in the initial chaotic moments, the sheer, overwhelming numerical superiority of the Japanese attackers quickly began to overwhelm the isolated, fragmented Australian positions. The defenders realized with absolute, horrifying clarity that they were fighting a completely hopeless battle against an unstoppable, surging human tide. Chaos rapidly consumed the dark, bloody beaches as intense, brutal hand-to-hand combat erupted entirely within the confusing labyrinth of the mangrove swamps. Australian soldiers desperately fixed their bayonets and fought like cornered animals, swinging their heavy rifle butts in a frantic, primal struggle for absolute survival. The agonizing screams of dying men echoed terribly through the suffocating darkness, perfectly mingling with the terrifying, continuous mechanical roar of enemy artillery shells exploding overhead. "Hold the bloody line, do not let them push inland," an officer screamed desperately before being instantly silenced by flying shrapnel. The fundamental collapse of the Allied communication network severely exacerbated the unfolding military disaster on the rapidly crumbling northwestern beaches. Artillery shells had completely severed the vital telephone cables connecting the frontline infantry battalions to their heavily fortified command headquarters located further inland. Isolated unit commanders found themselves fighting entirely blind in the terrifying darkness, completely unable to call for desperately needed artillery support or coordinate tactical retreats with neighboring defensive positions. This terrifying isolation fostered rampant, uncontrollable panic, accelerating the horrific disintegration of the entire defensive perimeter along the bleeding coast. By the early hours of February 9th, the overwhelmingly massive Japanese assault force had successfully torn a massive, bleeding hole through the Australian lines. The legendary, supposedly impenetrable fortress of Singapore had been catastrophically breached from the landward side, completely invalidating decades of arrogant British military planning and profound strategic overconfidence. The surviving Australian defenders were violently pushed backward into the dense, confusing island interior, desperately attempting to establish a secondary defensive line amidst the terrifying chaos. Would they successfully regroup in time, or simply be annihilated by the rapidly advancing enemy vanguard? General Percival received the horrific reports of the catastrophic northwestern breach with a profound, paralyzing sense of absolute, utter disbelief. He had gambled the entire fate of the heavily populated island on his fundamentally flawed assumption regarding the precise location of the enemy invasion. Desperate, frantic orders were rapidly issued to immediately reposition the massive, idle British forces from the quiet northeastern beaches toward the violently collapsing Western Front. However, executing such a massive, complex logistical redeployment in complete darkness, while under constant, relentless enemy aerial bombardment, proved to be practically impossible. The relentless Japanese momentum proved absolutely unstoppable as they violently pushed deeper into the vulnerable, exposed heart of the trapped island. They rapidly captured the crucial, strategically vital Tenga airfield, immediately establishing a terrifying forward operating base for their relentless, devastating close air support squadrons. Allied soldiers retreating through the dense rubber plantations found themselves continuously hunted from above by agile, predatory fighter planes strafing everything that moved on the ground. The protective canopy of the jungle had completely vanished, leaving the broken, terrified defenders entirely exposed to the merciless, burning tropical sky. Amidst the horrifying, widespread slaughter, countless acts of incredible, desperate heroism were fiercely displayed by the heavily outnumbered Australian infantrymen. Small, isolated pockets of highly determined soldiers stubbornly refused to surrender their completely surrounded positions, fighting to the absolute last bullet in a truly suicidal display of profound military courage. They inflicted incredibly heavy, punishing casualties upon the aggressively advancing Japanese columns, significantly slowing the enemy momentum and buying precious, bloody hours for the retreating main forces. However, these magnificent, tragic sacrifices ultimately could not reverse the inevitable, crushing tide of absolute, catastrophic defeat. The psychological toll of the continuous, brutal combat finally began to severely fracture the fragile discipline of the deeply traumatized Allied garrison. Rumors of massive, horrific massacres committed by the ruthless Japanese forces rapidly spread like a terrifying wildfire among the utterly exhausted, terrified frontline troops. Seeing the complete, undeniable collapse of their defensive strategy, a significant number of desperate soldiers abandoned their weapons and frantically fled toward the chaotic southern harbor. There is absolutely no hope left. The entire bloody island is lost. A deserting corporal muttered darkly as he vanished into the panicked civilian crowds. General Yamashita brilliantly recognized the immense psychological vulnerability of his entirely trapped and thoroughly demoralized military opponents. He continuously commanded his heavy artillery to systematically target the densely populated, civilian-heavy city center of Singapore, deliberately attempting to maximize horrific collateral damage and uncontrollable panic. The streets violently erupted into terrifying infernos of shattered glass and burning buildings. As thousands of innocent civilians desperately sought non-existent shelter from the relentless, falling steel rain, the tragic siege had rapidly devolved into a horrific, merciless slaughter, perfectly setting the bloody stage for an inevitable, deeply humiliating capitulation. As the defensive perimeter violently shrank, the critical, life-sustaining infrastructure of the besieged island began to catastrophically fail under the intense bombardment. Japanese forces strategically captured the vital reservoirs and massive pumping stations located in the island's center, violently cutting off the primary fresh water supply to the desperate city. Hospitals became terrifying, overflowing nightmares of agonizing pain, completely lacking the necessary water to properly sterilize surgical instruments or hydrate the thousands of critically wounded soldiers. The agonizing, absolute realization that thirst would ultimately kill them before enemy bullets deeply terrified the surviving Allied command structure. The terrifying reality of the massive, catastrophic breach on the northwestern coast fundamentally shattered the very core of the legendary British imperial prestige. The supposedly invincible fortress, heavily funded and arrogantly boasted about for decades, had effectively fallen in a matter of a few bloody, chaotic hours. The exhausted, traumatized Australian soldiers who had somehow survived the horrific initial assault now found themselves trapped in a rapidly shrinking, terrifying pocket of absolute death. They gripped their empty rifles in the choking, smoke-filled darkness, silently praying for a miraculous, impossible salvation that would tragically never arrive. The Japanese Imperial Army violently consolidated their massive gains along the breached northwestern coast, rapidly bringing ashore heavy tanks and vital logistical supplies. They aggressively prepared for the final, bloody push toward the densely populated southern city center, where the deeply panicked Allied forces were desperately attempting to organize a final, suicidal stand. Yamashita's terrifying, brilliant strategic vision had been perfectly executed, successfully outmaneuvering the deeply entrenched British commanders at every single, critical tactical junction. The inescapable, terrifying shadow of absolute humiliating defeat now loomed heavily and permanently over the burning, destroyed island of Singapore. Major General Gordon Bennett furiously paced his damp, subterranean command bunker, profoundly angered by the sheer incompetence that had needlessly doomed his brave men. He fiercely maintained that if his urgent, desperate warnings regarding the vulnerability of the northwestern coastline had been respected, this catastrophic disaster could have been entirely averted. The bitter, toxic recriminations between the Australian and British military leadership rapidly escalated, completely poisoning the atmosphere within the deeply compromised, failing Allied command structure. However, assigning historical blame was utterly irrelevant to the thousands of desperate soldiers bleeding violently to death in the surrounding, unforgiving mud. As the dark, smoke-filled sky began to gradually lighten on the fateful morning of February 10th, the devastating scale of the absolute disaster became undeniably clear. The entire northwestern defensive sector was completely gone, violently replaced by a massive, heavily armed, and totally unstoppable Japanese military juggernaut. The terrifying, bloody battle for the isolated island of Singapore had rapidly entered its absolute final, most desperate, and unimaginably horrific terminal phase. The surviving defenders braced themselves for the ultimate, violent destruction of their once proud, arrogantly boastful, and supposedly invincible imperial military stronghold. As the Japanese war machine relentlessly ground its way inland, the psychological and physical collapse of the Allied forces accelerated drastically. The lush, tropical interior of the island, once considered a safe haven, rapidly transformed into a sprawling, chaotic battlefield. General Yamashita directed his hardened veterans toward the strategically vital hills of Bukit Timah, the highest point and the geographical heart of the fortress. Capturing this elevated terrain would provide the Japanese with an unobstructed vantage point to rain artillery fire directly upon the civilian city center. Could the exhausted defenders somehow muster the strength to hold this critical summit? The ensuing battle for Bukit Timah became a horrifying spectacle of intense, close-quarters slaughter amidst the burning tropical vegetation. Australian and British troops, depleted of heavy ammunition and fundamentally demoralized, launched desperate bayonet counterattacks against the advancing Japanese armor. They fought furiously through the dense smoke, utilizing grenades and rifles in a savage attempt to halt the unstoppable mechanized thrust. However, the superior tactics of the enemy infantry quickly outflanked the stubborn defensive pockets, leaving the scattered Allied soldiers to bleed out in the mud. How many brave men would violently perish in this hopeless delaying action? With the devastating loss of the high ground, the fundamental logistical backbone of the entire British defense catastrophically disintegrated. Massive military supply depots, stockpiled with tons of essential rations and vital fuel, were rapidly overrun by the aggressively advancing enemy. The defending infantrymen found their ammunition pouches completely empty, forced to scavenge bullets from the bodies of their fallen comrades just to continue the futile struggle. Extreme hunger and profound physical exhaustion gnawed relentlessly at their wavering resolve as the oppressive tropical heat drained their remaining energy. Without bullets or bread, how could any army possibly continue to fight? The most devastating strategic blow occurred when Japanese vanguard units successfully captured the island's primary water reservoirs and massive pumping stations. General Percival secretly feared this exact, nightmarish scenario, knowing that a densely populated tropical city could not survive without a stable supply of fresh drinking water. The mechanical thumping of the great pumps suddenly ceased, replacing the lifeline of the city with a terrifying, absolute silence that spelled impending doom. Thirst rapidly emerged as a weapon far more lethal and indiscriminate than any artillery shell raining from the sky. When would the massive pipes finally run completely dry? Inside the sprawling, overwhelmed military hospitals, the agonizing reality of the water crisis created a scene of unimaginable, horrific human suffering. Thousands of critically wounded soldiers lay densely packed on blood-soaked floors, crying out continuously for a single drop of water to soothe their parched throats. Desperate surgeons were forced to operate without any ability to properly wash their hands or sterilize surgical instruments, leading to massive outbreaks of fatal gangrene. The heavy stench of death and untreated infected wounds hung suffocatingly thick in the stifling, unventilated wards. Could salvation ever reach these doomed, broken men in time? General Yamashita mercilessly exploited this internal collapse by intensifying the indiscriminate artillery bombardment upon the heavily congested civilian sectors of Singapore. High explosive shells shattered the fragile roofs of hospitals and residential blocks alike, demonstrating a terrifying disregard for the established rules of warfare. The terrified civilian populace, swollen by hundreds of thousands of panicked refugees from the mainland, desperately cowered in shallow, overflowing roadside ditches. Entire families were violently buried alive beneath the flaming rubble of their own homes as the magnificent colonial architecture violently crumbled into dust. Would this relentless rain of steel completely exterminate the trapped population? Under the crushing weight of continuous bombardment and undeniable tactical defeat, the rigid military discipline of the Allied garrison began to violently fracture. Thousands of traumatized, leaderless soldiers abandoned their posts, throwing away their rifles in a frantic bid for personal survival. They wandered aimlessly through the burning city streets, breaking into abandoned shops to consume stolen liquor, desperately trying to numb the terrifying reality of their impending death or capture. This uncontrollable epidemic of desertion fundamentally crippled the final defensive lines. Who could possibly restore order to an army rapidly descending into pure, terrified madness? The bustling southern harbor of the island rapidly degenerated into a scene of absolute, horrifying chaos as armed deserters violently clashed with desperate civilians. Panicked soldiers violently forced their way onto the few remaining evacuation vessels, selfishly shoving weeping women and terrified children aside at gunpoint. Military police frantically fired their revolvers into the air, screaming desperately, "Stand back, or we will shoot you where you stand." Yet, the overwhelming tide of human desperation easily trampled these futile attempts to maintain any semblance of civilized evacuation protocols. Was this shameful, violent scramble the true, pathetic legacy of the British Empire? While the streets descended into violent anarchy, a bitter and incredibly toxic command dispute completely paralyzed the Allied headquarters, operating deep underground. Major General Gordon Bennett openly expressed his profound contempt for the British command structure, firmly believing they had needlessly sacrificed his magnificent Australian troops. He stubbornly prioritized the immediate survival of his remaining men over the increasingly suicidal demands of General Percival to mount completely futile counterattacks against superior armor. This deep, irreconcilable division among the highest-ranking generals ensured that any coordinated, effective defense of the remaining perimeter was impossible. Would their personal pride doom them all? General Arthur Percival sat numbly in his damp, suffocating bunker, staring at telegrams from Winston Churchill that demanded his army fight to the absolute last man. The Prime Minister's distant, disconnected rhetoric spoke grandly of imperial honor and glorious sacrifice. But Percival knew these words meant nothing to soldiers dying of thirst. He was paralyzed by the agonizing moral weight of his impending decision, fully realizing that continued resistance would only result in the senseless massacre of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. How could a commanding officer possibly justify such catastrophic slaughter just to preserve political pride? The tactical map spread across Percival's heavy wooden desk painted a stark, undeniable picture of absolute military doom. The formidable Japanese perimeter was rapidly shrinking like a tightening iron noose, aggressively compressing the surviving Allied forces into a tiny, heavily targeted urban kill zone. Communication with the remaining frontline units had completely evaporated, leaving the isolated battalions to face the relentless enemy onslaught without any strategic guidance or vital artillery support. The proud, sprawling fortress had been violently reduced to a mere few square miles of burning rubble. Was there literally anywhere left for the defeated army to hide? Frontline troops still clinging desperately to their shattered defensive trenches experienced a profound, terrifying sense of absolute abandonment. The relentless Japanese snipers picked off anyone foolish enough to raise their head above the muddy parapet, while heavy mortar shells continuously pounded the earth into bloody craters. The surviving Australian soldiers, severely dehydrated, stared blankly into the dense, swirling smoke, their bodies operating purely on raw, primitive survival instincts. They knew the Empire had fundamentally failed them, leaving them to die violently in a foreign jungle. Would the morning sun ever pierce through this suffocating, endless curtain of black smoke? As the dark, terrifying reality of their situation firmly settled, General Bennett secretly began formulating a highly controversial, desperate plan for his own personal escape. He rationalized that his extensive, bloody experience fighting the Japanese in the jungle was far too valuable to be wasted languishing in a brutal prisoner of war camp. Quietly gathering a very small, trusted group of loyal officers, he actively prepared to abandon his doomed division before the formal capitulation was officially signed. Was this a necessary strategic preservation of a brilliant tactical mind, or the ultimate cowardly betrayal of his bleeding? By the morning of February 14th, the situation within the shrinking Allied perimeter had transitioned from critically desperate to completely, undeniably terminal. The municipal water engineers grimly reported to General Percival that the city's remaining water reserves would be entirely exhausted within 24 hours, guaranteeing a horrific, immediate civilian catastrophe. Epidemics of deadly diseases were already raging uncontrollably through the tightly packed, unsanitary refugee camps scattered across the burning urban center. The terrifying sounds of Japanese infantry cheering victoriously echoed loudly just a few miles from the main command bunker. How much longer could this tragic resistance truly endure? Recognizing that the total annihilation of his entire command was absolute, General Percival slowly stood up from his heavy wooden desk, his face pale and deeply drawn. He formally summoned all of his remaining senior commanders, including the deeply resentful General Bennett, to a final, incredibly somber council of war in the underground bunker. The heavy, damp air inside the concrete room was suffocatingly thick with the bitter, unspoken acknowledgement of their shared, catastrophic military failure. The impregnable fortress was already dead from the inside out. It was merely a terrifying matter of formalizing the profoundly humiliating, inevitable surrender. The senior officers gathered around the dimly lit table, their immaculate uniforms covered in gray dust and their eyes reflecting the horrifying trauma of the past week. Percival briefly summarized the catastrophic lack of water, ammunition, and food, stating clearly that further military resistance would simply result in the senseless murder of their own wounded soldiers. He looked around the silent, defeated room, waiting for any voice to offer a miraculous, impossible tactical solution that he had somehow tragically overlooked. However, only a heavy, agonizing silence answered him, confirming that the proud British Empire had finally, permanently fallen. On the remarkably grim morning of February 15th, 1942, the devastating reality of total defeat finally descended upon the smoking ruins of Singapore. It was tragically the Lunar New Year, a day traditionally meant for joyful celebration, but the suffocating tropical air was instead heavily choked with the dark, toxic ash of a dying empire. General Arthur Percival, his face pale and deeply drawn with profound exhaustion, formally accepted the agonizing inevitability that his entire trapped army could no longer resist the relentless enemy onslaught. Would history ever forgive this monumental, catastrophic failure of British military leadership? In a profoundly humiliating procession that would forever scar the collective memory of the British Empire, General Percival and his senior staff officers solemnly marched toward the enemy lines. They carried a stark, heavy white flag of surrender, trudging exhaustedly down the cratered, violently scarred Bukit Timah Road under the merciless, burning tropical sun. Japanese soldiers lined the devastated streets, their faces displaying a mixture of fierce pride and cold contempt for the defeated, exhausted colonial masters. What terrifying fate eagerly awaited the tens of thousands of deeply traumatized Allied soldiers now helplessly trapped entirely behind them? The fateful, historic meeting occurred within the suffocatingly hot, heavily damaged boardroom of the old Ford Motor Factory, a grim setting for an empire's ultimate capitulation. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the fiercely intimidating tiger of Malaya, violently slammed his fist onto the heavy wooden table, aggressively demanding a completely unconditional surrender from the broken British commander. Percival, desperately attempting to negotiate better terms for his deeply exhausted and severely dehydrated men, was brutally cut off by Yamashita's terrifying, translated roar of absolute authority. Could any amount of desperate diplomatic pleading possibly soften the terrifying wrath of the victorious conquerors? With absolutely no strategic leverage remaining and his massive army facing immediate, horrific slaughter from severe dehydration and continuous artillery bombardment, Percival finally yielded to the inevitable. He slowly reached into his pocket, his hand trembling slightly with profound, agonizing grief, and signed the formal document of unconditional capitulation, effectively ending British rule in Malaya. At precisely 6 to 10 in the evening, the deafening, relentless roar of the Japanese heavy artillery finally ceased, replaced by a haunting, terrifying silence across the devastated island fortress. Was this sudden, unnatural quiet truly a relief, or merely the dark prelude to an unimaginable nightmare? While the devastating surrender was being formalized in the cramped factory, Major General Gordon Bennett executed his highly controversial, deeply debated plan for personal escape. Refusing to endure the profound humiliation of a brutal Japanese prisoner of war camp, he secretly commandeered a small civilian vessel and vanished into the dark, treacherous waters of the strait. He justified this extraordinary, desperate action by claiming his invaluable knowledge of Japanese jungle tactics needed to be urgently returned to the vulnerable Australian mainland. Was this incredibly daring, nocturnal flight a brilliant act of strategic preservation or a deeply shameful military betrayal? Bennett's sudden, shocking departure left his deeply traumatized, entirely defeated Australian 8th Division completely rudderless during their most vulnerable, terrifying hour of absolute need. When the desperate, exhausted soldiers finally learned that their fierce, outspoken commander had secretly abandoned them to their horrific fate, a profound wave of bitter resentment swept through the surviving ranks. They had fought magnificently and bled profusely under his direct orders, only to be ultimately left behind to face the terrifying, unknown brutality of the victorious Imperial Army alone. How could military discipline possibly survive such a catastrophic, heartbreaking collapse of trusted senior leadership? In the incredibly bleak, suffocating days immediately following the formal surrender, over 15,000 surviving Australian soldiers were forcibly herded toward the sprawling Changi prison complex. They marched exhaustedly through the devastated, fiercely burning streets, their once proud military uniforms reduced to filthy, blood-stained rags clinging loosely to their severely emaciated, deeply traumatized bodies. The Japanese guards heavily beat anyone who dared to stumble or fall, immediately establishing a terrifying, brutal regime of absolute, unquestioned physical dominance over the broken Allied prisoners. Could these fiercely independent, historically proud fighting men somehow mentally endure the profound, systematic degradation of horrific captivity? Life within the heavily guarded, barbed wire confines of the massive Changi camp quickly devolved into a desperate, daily struggle for absolute, fundamental human survival. Severe malnutrition rapidly became rampant as the brutal Japanese administration deliberately provided only minuscule, entirely inadequate rations of rotting, insect-infested rice to the starving, exhausted prisoners. Deadly tropical diseases, including dysentery and malaria, swept ruthlessly through the densely packed, highly unsanitary concrete barracks, mercilessly claiming the fragile lives of hundreds of deeply weakened soldiers. How long could the resilient human spirit possibly hold out against such calculated, relentless, and profoundly cruel physical deprivation? The horrific nightmare of Changi was tragically only the preliminary, terrifying chapter in a much longer, unimaginably brutal saga of profound, continuous human suffering. Thousands of these captured Australian troops were eventually transported like cattle in incredibly cramped, suffocatingly hot metal boxcars to construct the infamous Thai-Burma Death Railway. They were ruthlessly forced to hack violently through impenetrable, disease-ridden jungles and massive, solid rock formations using only primitive hand tools and their rapidly deteriorating physical strength. Would any of these forgotten, terribly abused men ever live to see the beautiful, comforting shores of their beloved homeland again? Working under the continuous, terrifying threat of savage beatings and summary executions by deeply sadistic camp guards, the emaciated Australian prisoners were pushed far beyond the absolute limits of human endurance. Tropical ulcers ate violently through their rotting flesh, straight down to the bone, while raging cholera epidemics wiped out entire forced labor camps in a matter of agonizing, horrific days. Mateship, the fiercely loyal, culturally defining Australian bond, became their only true currency of survival as starving men desperately shared their final, tiny handfuls of rice. Could profound brotherly love truly conquer the darkest depths of absolute manufactured hell? The catastrophic, complete loss of the entire Australian 8th Division at Singapore sent an unprecedented, paralyzing shockwave of pure, unadulterated terror violently rippling throughout the entire Australian continent. For generations, the fiercely loyal Dominion had blindly, enthusiastically relied upon the mighty British Royal Navy and the supposedly impregnable Singapore Fortress as their primary, absolute shield against any northern aggression. That legendary, comforting shield had now been completely, humiliatingly shattered into millions of useless pieces in a mere 70 agonizing, bloody days of continuous tactical disaster. Who would successfully protect the vulnerable, completely exposed Australian mainland from the rapidly advancing Japanese Empire, facing the most terrifying, existential geopolitical crisis in its entire national history? The desperately frightened Australian government was brutally forced to radically reevaluate its deeply entrenched global alliances. Prime Minister John Curtin famously made a deeply controversial, historically unprecedented public declaration, unequivocally stating that Australia now looked directly toward the United States of America for its immediate military salvation. This profound, highly necessary diplomatic pivot officially severed the traditional, deeply emotional, and historically subservient strategic reliance upon the failing British Empire. Was this historic shift a temporary wartime necessity, or the permanent birth of an entirely new geopolitical identity? The profoundly humiliating, rapid capitulation of the heavily fortified Singapore Island permanently, violently shattered the long-standing, arrogant colonial myth of inherent Western military and racial superiority across the entire Asian continent. The deeply oppressed local populations had actively watched a supposedly invincible, incredibly wealthy European empire be completely, effortlessly crushed by an aggressively expanding, highly adaptive Asian military force. This devastating psychological awakening significantly fueled fierce, unstoppable nationalist independence movements that would eventually violently dismantle the entire British imperial structure in the post-war era. Could the deeply wounded, crumbling empire ever possibly recover its lost global prestige and unquestioned authority? For the thousands of deeply traumatized Australian prisoners languishing in horrific, disease-ridden jungle camps, grand global geopolitical shifts meant absolutely nothing. Their entire universe had tragically shrunk to the immediate, desperate struggle of simply surviving the next brutal beating or the next agonizing bout of malaria. They secretly whispered faint, desperate hopes of an eventual Allied victory, clinging fiercely to faded photographs of their smiling families hidden carefully inside their ragged uniforms. Would the rapidly advancing Allied military forces ever reach these completely forgotten, violently suffering men in time to prevent their absolute, tragic extermination? When the horrific, bloody global conflict finally concluded in late 1945, the surviving Australian prisoners of war were miraculously, joyously liberated from their absolute jungle nightmare. Returning home, these incredibly brave, deeply scarred men were hauntingly thin, practically walking skeletons whose profoundly sunken eyes reflected unimaginable, horrific depths of continuous human suffering and brutal degradation. The fiercely joyful national celebrations of ultimate military victory were heavily, permanently muted by the profound, collective grief for the thousands of young soldiers who would tragically never return. How could an entirely traumatized nation possibly heal from such an unprecedented deep psychological wound? The deeply controversial, highly debated legacy of General Gordon Bennett continuously haunted the entire Australian military establishment long after the war's final, bloody conclusion. Formal military inquiries passionately argued whether his daring, desperate midnight escape from the burning island constituted a brilliant necessity or a fundamentally cowardly, shameful dereliction of his ultimate command duties. Although he fiercely defended his actions until his death, the bitter, lingering resentment from the surviving soldiers he left behind permanently tarnished his once stellar, highly respected military reputation. Can a military commander ever truly justify abandoning his deeply loyal, violently bleeding men in the dark? The catastrophic, humiliating fall of the supposed Impregnable Fortress remains one of the most profoundly studied, fiercely debated military disasters in modern global history. It serves as a dark, powerful, and enduring testament to the fatal dangers of profound strategic arrogance, deeply flawed defensive assumptions, and completely underestimating the remarkable adaptability of a highly motivated enemy. the massive, silenced coastal guns of Singapore still stand today as solemn, rusted monuments to a completely failed, arrogantly conceived colonial military doctrine. What ultimate, enduring lessons must future military generations learn from this incredibly bloody, deeply humiliating historical tragedy? Ironically, the unprecedented, horrific military disaster deeply forged a completely new, fiercely independent national identity within the fundamentally traumatized Australian civilian population. No longer content to merely act as obedient, subservient imperial subjects fighting distant wars for the British crown, Australia rapidly developed a highly pragmatic, self-reliant approach to its own sovereign defense. The unimaginable, profound sacrifices of the 8th Division deeply cemented the powerful, culturally vital legend of resilient mateship and enduring courage into the very bedrock of the proud national soul. Can ultimate, profound historical tragedy eventually give birth to a stronger, completely unified modern nation? The long, dark, and deeply agonizing shadow of the Singapore surrender continues to emotionally resonate powerfully throughout the collective historical memory of the vast Australian nation. Every single year, solemn, highly emotional memorial services respectfully honor the thousands of brave, magnificent young men who were violently sacrificed to a deeply flawed, fundamentally arrogant imperial illusion. Their tragic, bloody story is not merely one of catastrophic military defeat, but of incredibly profound, astonishing human endurance in the absolute, terrifying face of unimaginable brutality. Will the incredible, deeply moving courage of these lost soldiers ever be truly forgotten by the generations that followed? Ultimately, the swift, incredibly violent collapse of the supposedly invincible Malayan defense violently closed the final, arrogant chapter of unquestioned British colonial dominance in the strategic Pacific theater. For Australia, the horrific loss of its massive, magnificent army deeply signaled a completely permanent, highly necessary geopolitical awakening that fundamentally altered its historical trajectory forever. The Impregnable Fortress had tragically, bloodily fallen in mere days, leaving behind a deeply devastated, violently traumatized landscape and a drastically reshaped modern world order. The tragic, enduring lessons of that terrifying, bloody February remain incredibly potent, powerfully warning against the fatal hubris of deeply entrenched empires.